All right, in Austria, the only thing I remember about Austria is they had what they called the dual monarchy. In effect, they had one king over two countries. The two countries were Austria and Hungary. Austria and Hungary united together under one monarch, and they called it the dual monarchy. Each nation was allowed to keep its own parliament, have its own money, have its own government, in effect, under one king. The idea did not work very well. Austria remained a weak nation, one of the weaker nations of Europe. The monarch was Franz Joseph, who ruled from 1848 to 1916. Don't worry about the dates. His name was Francis Joseph. I call him Francis Joseph. That was 68 years, folks. He was the emperor of the dual monarchy. It ended, he died in the middle of World War I. It was his son who was assassinated that got World War I started. Here again, we're going to be hearing more about Joseph later, Francis Joseph. Here's head of the dual monarchy. All right, Russia. Russia lost the Crimean War, again, which I've skipped that part of this class, but you can get it online. Russia lost the Crimean War, and they began to realize that, hey, we're behind the rest of Europe. I mean, they felt utterly humiliated, but they didn't want to change. And again, if you look into detailed history of Russia, you'll find that much of their history in the last 400 years has been a history of a people who know we're behind, let's reform, well, we're behind, what reform should we make? And they still were behind. And even during my lifetime, we were behind and trying to catch up, behind and trying to catch up. Same here. Behind and trying to catch up. But finally, in 1861, Tsar Alexander III, don't remember his name so much, but just remember he freed now, 1861, does anybody happen to know what was happening in the United States in 1861? That might be related. What's that? Civil War started. Yeah, excellent. The Civil War started, and the main issue, really, I mean, some of the historians have tried to say the main issue was states' rights, but the main issue was really slavery. And this has been shown, particularly the Union soldiers who went to fight. They were fighting over the issue of slavery. But in 1861, the Russian Tsar, with a stroke of his pen, freed some 5 million serfs. At this point, all the serfs in Europe were now free. The Enlightenment had said there shouldn't be serfdom. Other nations in Europe had slowly freed the serfs. As for Napoleon, everywhere he conquered, he freed the serfs. When he conquered northern Italy, he freed the serfs there. He freed the serfs in Holland. Of course, the serfs in France were already freed. Everywhere he conquered, he ended serfdom. But finally, now, before him, another Tsar, before the one in 1861, had wanted to free the serfs, but the nobility wouldn't let him. But by 1861, Russia was embarrassed to be the only country on the European continent still had serfdom. And I really think in the case of the United States, if some people in the United States would have had more patience, the issue of slavery would have ended by itself, partly because the slave owners would have been ashamed to be the only country in the world. I mean, well, I think Russia was embarrassed to have serfs, and later, in 1880, the last Western nation to free, Brazil, freed its slaves. Why did Brazil free their slaves? I think they were shamed out of it, largely. I mean, here, we're the only nation on the earth that still has slavery, and, you know, they were somewhat shamed out of it, and I think that was the case of Russia. Anyway, Alexander the II, who had freed the serfs, made some other attempts at reform. Again, Russia, the whole story of Russian history is a story of reform, but the reforms never seem to be enough. Anyway, finally Alexander II was assassinated, and he was replaced by a son who was against reform. But then what happened next is a subject for a later chapter, but to make a long story short, Russia was to eventually fall to communism. And the events that's going on in Russia now is to lead to the communistic takeover. All right. Your book talks about the European state. Democracy was becoming more the norm in places like Great Britain and France, but autocracy was becoming the norm throughout much of Central Europe and Russia. Again, what I mean by autocracy, the rule by one man, autocrat. One man governing. Democracy, ruled by the people. And democracy was growing in Western Europe, particularly in France and Britain. In Central Europe, Germany built up the most powerful army on the continent. Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm, who reigned from 1888 to 1918. And you may know that he was deposed in 1918. He lived until 1940, but in 1918 he was deposed because President Woodrow Wilson of the United States wanted him deposed after Germany lost the war. But he built up the most powerful army in Europe. And knowing as he did that Europe had the most powerful army made him think that he could do anything he pleased. He tried it, and he wound up being a whole man in a small plot of land in Holland, mowing a garden like a commoner, completely devoid of his titles, devoid of all his wealth, fled his country, and but he thought that he could conquer the world, even as Napoleon tried to, and even as Hitler was later to try to. Kaiser Wilhelm built up a powerful army. Oh yeah, your book uses the term anti-Semitism here in the middle of page 570, as in dark bold print. And your book mentions that Germany was flaming the flames of anti-Semitism during the time, and this was to lead to the Holocaust of the 1940s, which occurred about 60 years or so after the events of this chapter. All right. Your book mentions that Austria had a problem with various nationalities, Czechs and Poles and Slavs and Germans and Austrians all living within the same empire. They did not get along together. In fact, Hitler claimed that he was a German even though he was born in Austria, and when he said that Germans in Austria are oppressed and used that as an excuse to take over, but it is true a lot of Germans were living in Austria at the time. All right, in the case of Russia, it wasn't enough that they were humiliated in the Crimean War in the 1850s, but in 1905, the Japanese made a sneak attack on their Port Arthur and took Port Arthur from them. Now this event was significant, and it was the first time an Asian nation had defeated a major European nation in a battle. Actually, it was the second time. Ethiopia defeated Italy. All right, Ethiopia defeated Italy once, and Japan then defeated Russia. The year was 1905 when Japan took Port Arthur from the Russians in a sneak attack. Now, does anybody know of another story where Japan decided they could make a Navy sneak attack and win? What's that? Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, yeah. 1905, well in 1941, about 36 years later, when some Japanese could still remember it, 36 years later, they decided, hey, we're going to make another sneak attack on a big nation. and this time we're going to win. So they made another sneak attack on the United States, only this time they didn't win. In the case of Russia, they got away with it. This humiliated Russia even further, and led the Russians to feel so humiliated, began to plan to rebel against the Tsarist regime. And of course, this was to lead to the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917. Now, the Ottoman Empire continued to be called the sick man of Europe. Your book tells you that the events in Europe at this time were leading up to a big war. Now, except for the Franco-Prussian War from 1871 until 1914, Europe was almost without a war. No bloodshed, hardly any, but everything in Europe was very uneasy. And the fuse that was destined to light up Europe was the Balkan region. Now, when I talk about the Balkans, I'm talking about Greece, Macedonia, Albania, Bulgaria, the peninsula between Italy and Turkey, the Greek peninsula. This is known as the Balkans. And it has sometimes been a tinderbox that set Europe off, and this was to become very true in 1914.